Hey everyone, we're just this is Matt. We're just gonna get from class of 2011. We're just gonna give everybody that has signed up a couple more minutes to join. So and then we'll kick off. So thanks for hopping on today. Hi everyone. My name is Matt Celine, class of 2011 at Holy Cross, and a member of the 2011 reunion fundraising committee. As one of the events that our class attempted to set up was a speaking session with on the economy, kind of coming out of COVID-19 pandemic. So unfortunately, we weren't able to do this in person, but we were able to arrange for Professor Baumann, who's a professor of economics at the school, to give a tutorial session on everything that's happened over the past 12 to 15 months. So we're thankful that he agreed to take the opportunity to speak with our alumni base. Rob is as I mentioned, he's a professor of economics at Holy Cross. He has a PhD from Ohio State University, and I'm from Pennsylvania, so I'll take a quick poke at him for that reason. But he specializes in econometrics and labor economics, and as I mentioned, we're really thankful that he offered up some of his time to speak with us today. So the agenda, he's gonna present some slides that he's prepared over the past couple of weeks, probably for 30 minutes or so. And then we'll have some time for a Q&A session. So to the extent you submitted questions beforehand, I have those in the docket. And then we'll also take questions submitted from the group that you can submit through the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom. So don't be shy. Rob's agreed to answer any and all questions, no matter how controversial. No, I'm just teasing. But so anyway, with that said, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Rob, and he'll walk us through the presentation that he's prepared for today.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, Holy Cross community. Good to talk to you, even though it's virtually. I've done a couple of these before, and I got to say, I'm always impressed with people's desire to continue learning. I assume you guys have your degrees. We're not doing this for credit, right? So I appreciate that you would look at something like, hey, how about a talk about the future of the economy, and log on a beautiful Saturday morning, right, wherever you might happen to be. So I'm a lucky man to be working here. There's no question about it. And, you know, when I see events like this and the alumni enthusiasm, and it reminds me of some of the things that we hear like in orientations about lifelong learners and stuff like that. Well, I think this is evidence of it, quite frankly. So congratulations to you for being here. First of all, we're going to try to make this as painless and as informative as possible. All right. So Matt was correct. All right. You can ask me whatever you want. I don't necessarily have to answer it, but please go ahead and put it out there. All right. Because we are here to hopefully share some information with you. So if there's something that you see on this presentation that's not covered, fire away. No big deal. All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen and send us over to the presentation. 1 second here. You guys are going to get a flavor of what it's been like in the classroom over the past, oh my gosh, 2.5 semesters or whatever it's been. So a lot of us are super excited, obviously, to be back into reality in the classroom. Matt, in a second here, I'm going to ask you to just speak up and verify you can see my screen. Can you see that, buddy?
Yep, I've got it up here. So
okay, good. All right. Anything comes up on the chat or technical difficulties, I'm not looking at anybody's face. So Matt, just go ahead and speak up and interrupt if that's what you have to do.
Okay.
Right. This is a title slide. This is pretty straightforward. You know what? I guess the only thing that's missing here is the seal of our institution. So I apologize for that. But as Matt explained, obviously, I work at the college and I've been fortunate enough to be there since 2003. So what we're going to begin here is just looking at some numbers. All right, just looking at some charts. And at the end of this, we'll try to digest everything that we picked up. Look, the last year has been tough, right? There's absolutely no question about that. Small silver lining, if you're an economics professor, this has all been fascinating, all right? Because we have never seen the kind of fluctuations that we are currently looking at, unless we want to go way back in time to the Great Depression. All right. The students that I had this semester, so we're talking about people that are 18 to 22 years old, they lived through the Great Recession, as we all did. All right. But, they have an understanding of look, we came out of one of these things 10 years ago. But in terms of how it compares to the Great Recession, to what we just currently live through with the pandemic, it wasn't even close. All right. Look at the size of these giant, and I think I've got my pencil annotator here. Just look at what's going on here. So there's Q2 of 2020. That's a contraction of, let me look at my other screen, 31%. We are looking at GDP, by the way, if you're not familiar with that, that's the value of everything that the country produces. All right. So this is an important metric to economists because GDP is basically income. All right. Everything is produced with the intention to be sold. Once it's sold, it becomes income for somebody else, which is why we track GDP so closely, because GDP and income, theoretically speaking, are exactly the same thing. All right. Now, practically speaking, if you run a business, you guys understand that everything you put on the shelf is not necessarily purchased that we get. But nevertheless, when you're looking at these big aggregate numbers, that's why there's so much focus on gross domestic product, because it's just such a natural tie-in to basically the income level of a country. And we have never seen that dip that I circled. Q2 of 2020, this is basically, a little bit more than a year ago, when everything changes basically for the entire planet. And we haven't seen a contraction like that quickly. I don't even think the Great Depression has a 1 quarter contraction that quick. All right, because the Great Depression was much more of a long, drawn out recession. And then, of course, what we see immediately after that, that's still the pandemic. So Q3, let me see here, that would be taking us to July, August, and September. And we see those gains, the losses that we had in the previous quarter, we basically flipped that script and turned it around. And so what we've been looking at, when I say we, I mean economists and other people that are in the industry, are these increases right here. And because of the size of those two large contractions and big ones, the kind of scale of this graph is a little messed up, but all of these numbers here are lower. All right. So the positive news here is that number one, it looks like we made up for GDP. And number two, our growth rate seems to be pretty strong. All right. Heading into 2021. Here's some other statistics that we track. If you were an econ major in the back of the day, the big ones for us are GDP, unemployment rate, and inflation. All right, I'll show you each of those today. But, for people in the real world out there, obviously the stock market and the performance of the housing market are pretty darn important too. We'll get to that in a second. I wanted to show you this picture of this 10-year profile of the unemployment rate in the United States. So right here, we're coming out of the Great Recession. By the way, unemployment during the Great Recession peaked at 10%. All right. right? So we're already recovering a little bit by the time this graph begins. And when you see that slow and steady decrease to under 4%, which is a really incredibly low unemployment rate. And then, of course, the pandemic hits and we hit this huge spike. All right. And then now we are looking at this recovery right here. Again, this might be more interesting to me. All right. As somebody that looks at data all the time, that's focused on the economy, we're usually looking at pictures like this and just trying to explain like these tiny little blips. That is not the case, obviously, with the pandemic. So for us, this has obviously been tragic and sad to see what was happening, but also really fascinating to see what we might be able to learn from it going forward. This is a picture of weekly and hourly earnings growth. All right. So obviously we want this to be going up. All right. This is the percent increase in either weekly or hourly earnings. And you know what? Like I'm looking at this graph and I'm reminding myself of something I would tell to my students. I don't know if I need both of these lines. I mean, after all, they all are right on top of each other. But nevertheless, like we see something pretty unusual here. This right here is when the pandemic begins. So if you take this at face value, what we're saying is that people are earning more money during the pandemic. All right. Now, that's a strange thing to say because the context of what's going on here is that the people that largely lost their jobs, in other words, the ones that we see in this huge unemployment peak right here, tended to be the lower wage earners. That's kind of a lasting lesson of recessions, is that they disproportionately hurt the folks that are on the lower end of the income scale. So what's going on here is that what happened is that a lot of those people that went unemployed were earning below average wages. So when it was recalculated, when you're doing average earnings, it makes it look like people are making more, which is true, but that of course only applies to the people that were able to retain their jobs. So I wanted to show this graph just to kind of send that lasting lesson, all right? Because obviously recessions are cyclical, all right? This is why we study the business cycle. We're going to see another one. We have been observing recessions and expansions in basically every country for as long as we've been tracking data. There's no such thing as a flat path. All right. And so like one of the lessons for the next recession is that keep in mind that usually the people that are hurt most by the recession are already the people that are earning less. All right. So I guess I think about that stuff when I'm pitching about policy prescriptions and sort of how to fix things, because this is not something that's felt evenly across all earners. And this is a graph that illustrates that. Another interesting thing here is what's happening to earnings growth coming out of the recession. One of the fascinating things of the economy in the teens prior to the pandemic is how incredibly flat earnings growth was. So what we were getting prior to the pandemic was ever decreasing unemployment. We get this path just inching down further and further and further. And usually what that translates into is bargaining power for the workers, all right? Because they could say to their boss, like, look, I'm just gonna go find another job because the labor market's tight, unless you pay me more. All right. And so typically we would see a picture like this for the unemployment rate. And what we would expect is that this picture would be going up. And that's not what we saw prior to the pandemic. And so here we are starting to see the beginnings of that, maybe, because of course we're only looking at a couple of months of data and we're going to have to see how that plays out. Hang in there, just a couple more pictures and I'll give you the summary here. This is the DJIA, probably one of the most important metrics of the stock market. This is basically like a aggregate stock price of, I want to say, is it the largest 500 companies? I can't remember exact number, but for the biggest companies that are traded out there, this is basically a metric that gives you a type of an average of their stock price. And so not surprising, boom, there's the pandemic right here. But of course, like what's been happening ever since that, if you were to draw a straight line through, is that this thing is ever increasing. All right. Something else that we're starting to realize is that the Dow Jones doesn't exactly reflect the economy in the same way that necessarily GDP and the unemployment would. So I guess I would think of it like this, if you've never studied economics before, like what I would relate it to is like what it must be like if you're like a general practitioner, like a physician. All right. There's obviously things that you know about the human body that are, definitely good or definitely bad for it. But at the end of the day, you cannot see everything and a lot of unexpected stuff happens. And also, like a doctor, there's a lot of different tools you could use to measure how a person is doing. And the same thing is true in the economy. All right. So there's no such thing, by the way, as grandiose as the title of this talk might be. Look, I have no idea exactly what's going to happen to the future of the economy, but I do study this stuff and I am reading the trends. All right. And I can just be straight with you about where things are a little confusing. And this is an example of where things are a little bit confusing, is that the Dow Jones doesn't necessarily give you the same information as GDP or unemployment. Doesn't make it worthless, all right? It just makes it different. And trying to tease out that separation is what we're trying to figure. Now, obviously, the Dow Jones is basically a measure of the value of a bunch of really large companies. And so maybe that's what's causing this key difference. But I guess what I would say here is that you can't always look at the Dow Jones and say to yourself, well, that's the measure of the overall economic health. But you know what? You also can't look at GDP and think of it in the exact same way. So, people in my line of work, we do kind of what you're going through right now. We're just trying to get as much information as we can to kind of digest what might be happening out there. The good news, if you have money in the stock market, is that I am optimistic. Of course, there's no promises that this is likely to continue to increase. And I'll give you more details about that once I get through all of the charts. I saw a question somebody had submitted earlier about housing price situations. So I dug up this graph and the one that follows. What you're looking at here are housing prices. This would be up here in the New England area. I have another one for those of you in the NYC area of 4 census designated places. You can see them down there at the bottom. Providence, and then what you would call Metro West in blue, Cambridge out to Framingham, kind of like inside that 495 loop. So think of like the Boston as like the inside 128. The blue line is between 128 and 495. And then, of course, south of there is what's going on in Providence, and even further west is where I currently am in Worcester. Now, all of these start at the same place. That doesn't mean all houses were equally valuable in 1991, but what you're looking here is to see the difference in the paths of growth. All right, so starting everybody at the same place at 0.100, what we see up here in New England is that the areas that have risen the largest are, not surprisingly, the stuff inside 495. All right, and so the red and blue lines right here are right on top of each other. All right, obviously housing prices have grown outside of that in Rhode Island and Worcester. In those two places have tracked, but obviously they haven't grown as fast. So if you've had a house for a long period of time, like I bet you could probably relate to this graph. Right here is when housing prices are incredibly increasing. What's up with the dip right here? Well, that's the Great Recession, the housing crisis. I'm sure you guys all remember that, especially if you're a homeowner. And if you take like the peak, right here in like 2005, like look how far it took us till basically 2017, all right, to get back to where things were prior to that. So if you're like me and you're sitting in a house that you bought in 2009, your mortgage was underwater, all right, up until a couple of years ago. And that wasn't because you weren't making the payments. It was simply because, obviously, the track of housing prices, something that influences all of us, but obviously we have no direct control over, kind of like the economy. Here's the NYC picture. You can see the 4 regions down there at the bottom. And I guess I wanted to include this one because once I put this graph up, I was like, oh, look at that. Look what's similar, right? Boston and Metro West, and also Providence and out here in Worcester. And then you get to this one here and you see 4 kind of divergent paths. All right. And it looks like the largest one out there, I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but I apologize. But I believe that's out there in Long Island, if I'm not mistaken. All right. And you know where the rest of these areas are. And that's where housing prices have grown the largest since 1991. And apologies to those of you out there in the 95 corridor in Connecticut, but your housing prices are going up, just not as fast as the other areas around NYC. Now, something I forgot to mention about this is take a look at these slopes right here. Sorry, I meant to, there we go. You see that steep slope? All right, in other words, like things like trending upward. And now look at this one right here. Same situation. All right, now it's hard to judge with your eye, but that is the fastest rising slope that we have in this entire graph. So what we are looking at right now is a very, very hot housing market. All right, so for those of you that are sitting on property, especially in these 2 regions, all right, obviously your housing price is going up. And I guess that probably applies to you no matter where in the country that you happen to be. We are in the middle of a very active real estate market up here in the Northeast, and best I can tell, all around the country. All right. So let's take a second to digest, all right, everything that I just showed you in pictures, all right. Here's what happens at the beginning of the pandemic, all right. Huge And when I say huge, I mean biggest we might have ever recorded, all right, in American economic history. Not world economic history, because we've had some sad events where wars or natural disasters wipe out huge portions of a country, all right? Outside of that stuff, all right, this is the largest contraction in one quarter that we have ever seen. And that does include, depending on how you want to measure it, the Great Depression. I'm softening my language there because that, of course, was like 90 years ago, and how things were measured back then, there's some doubt. All right. It's not as cleaned up or regimented as it is today. But nevertheless, whether it's bigger than what happened in the Great Depression or about the same, it's still depressing. All right. This happened in the stock market too. And obviously this was felt in unemployment. All right. All of this stuff is true. Housing prices, meanwhile, didn't really do all that much. And we have that kind of curiosity of average earnings going up. But again, to somebody in my line of work, this is just evidence of who lost their job during the recession. Again, like when you take those people that are earning below average out of that mean, what you do is you raise that average up. All right. So I don't think people are getting raises during the pandemic. I mean, I know I did, and I'm guessing nobody else did out there. It's just a difference of who is in that calculation. And then our recovery, or shortly afterwards, we get that huge rebound. And when I say shortly afterwards, I literally mean one quarter later. All right. So we're still wearing masks. We still don't have vaccinations at this point, because remember, this is late summer into early fall of last year. All right. So the pandemic is still rolling here, but output completely rebounds like right at that point. In a lot of ways, it's kind of impressive when you think about how we were living in quarter three, that we were able to erase all those losses, even though like our work situation had not really changed all that much. In my opinion, like it's kind of a tribute to how we rebounded so quickly. All right. Only really one quarter, right, in economic terms. And that same thing is true that we see here in unemployment, and what we get is big gains in housing values. And then, of course, like what we saw with hourly and weekly earnings that went up, that retracted because a lot of those lower age earners got their jobs back, which means they went back in that calculation, which mean hourly and weekly earnings initially fell. I guess the story I'm trying to paint here is that when you look at average earnings, you always have to be thinking about who is in that calculation. So another classic example of looking at hourly earnings on the average and seeing them go up or down, there's more to that story, all right? Because again, it all depends on who's going into that average. All right. So as I tell the students, and I know there's some econ majors here before, and if there's not, that's fine too. The government, any government, has really two policy tools it could use to influence the macro economy. That's fiscal and monetary policy. Now, these are fancy names for really what are simple processes. Fiscal policy is just the budget. All right. So, you know, if you took an econ class, that's capital G and capital T. Capital G is government spending. That's the money going out. Capital T is taxes. That's the money coming in. All right. Really simple as that. Now, the way economic theory works, you can see this like highlight that I have down here. If you are a Keynesian person, all right, the idea is that during a recession, the one entity in the economy, which is the government, that can borrow should be borrowing, all right, to basically make up for those losses in GDP. And what we had were two giant packages that did exactly that. In the United States, we have not had a recession relief package of this size. And of course, like when I say of this size, like, of course, like we've never hit these numbers before. All right. The value of a dollar is different than it used to be. But even if you measure it relative to the size of the economy, we have never acted so swiftly in the face of a recession. We have acted swiftly in the face of war, all right, where we see like huge increases in the budget during World War I. Hey, here's a fun fact for you. We didn't have an income tax prior to World War I. And then when World War I hit, obviously we need the money. And there's where the income tax begins that we still have today in some form. All right. World War II would be another example where there was a huge increase in government spending, because if we were there during that time, I think you could easily argue, look, there's an existential threat here. So forgetting that stuff aside, all right, we have the largest responses that we've ever seen. We also had a fiscal policy response to the Great Recession. All right, that's when Obama was in office. That was about $800 billion. And that $800 billion was spread out over 10 years. All right, you can see like we're at a total of 4.1 trillion, according to what you're looking at here. But there were an assortment of other smaller packages, like some benefits, particularly in unemployment, got expended, so the total price tag, I think, is probably closer to 4.5. All right, I'd have to do the calculations. I should know that off the top of my head. So again, like the Great Recession, like we didn't even spend $1 trillion on fiscal policy for that. This COVID pandemic, all right, what we spent was far larger. In fairness, all right, this was a much bigger contraction to the economy than the Great Recession. So maybe this was all measured, all right. But nevertheless, like John Maynard Keynes is probably celebrating, or maybe his ghost is, because this is the exact kind of stuff that he was writing about back in 1935. Aggressive fiscal policy responses. Of course, that comes with a cost, and we'll talk about that in a second. All right, but nevertheless, this is a little factoid I wanted to present to you. What we did with our budget in the United States, in other words, our fiscal policy, was the most aggressive response to a non-war situation that the country has ever pursued. Here's the other policy that a government has at its fingertips, and that's monetary policy, which is just really a fancy name for how much money is printed. All right. Now, this is handled in each country by that country's central bank. The central bank in the United States is the Federal Reserve. So we just call it the Fed for short. It has two primary responsibilities. One is printing money. The other one is regulating banks. All right. And if you were asking, like, well, why do banks need to be regulated? You know what I mean? Like, what makes them special? Boy, I could do a whole hour, all right, of why we need banks to be regulated. All right. If you want like a brief history of the importance of regulating banks, look what happened to the American economy between the Civil War and World War I, where we were having constant recessions that were called panics back in that era. Panic of 1879, panic of 1873, et cetera, that were largely fueled by bank runs. All right. So I'm not going to break out my Jimmy Stewart impersonation, but what was that? It's a Wonderful Life or Miracle on 34th Street. No, I think it's A Wonderful Life. That's a story where there's a bank run scene where he jumps on the counter and all the customers are trying to get their money out because they don't think the bank has it. So anyway, you can tell I can't stop talking about the Fed. Like, this is something that I do in class that I feel like is one of the most important and one of the most misunderstood organizations that we have. I could also go long form on cryptocurrency, which scares the daylights out of me. All right. Because cryptocurrency is not really regulated by any organization that has any interests of the people. It's all like a blockchain kind of technology. Believe me, you want people in charge of printing money that know what they're doing. All right. And I'm not saying the Fed is perfect. All right. But it's kind of like our all-star team. You know what I mean? They hire some of the best economists, and they make mistakes too. All right. But nevertheless, it's a heavily regulated system. So how does the Fed work? All right. Again, they are effectively just printing money. All right. Now, the process of printing money ultimately influences interest rates. So what the Fed does when it meets, all right, and actually probably what it does every day in the morning when it wakes up, is it looks at the current level of interest rates and thinks about whether it wants it to go up or down. Now, when it's trying to expand the economy, the idea is to lower interest rates, which encourages people to borrow, save for a home. By the way, this is one of the reasons why the housing market is so hot, because interest rates continue to be rock bottom, right? Or a college education, or a car, or whatever it happens to be, all right? So obviously, when we hit a recession, what the Fed is trying to do is pull interest rates down. And that's initially what their goal was by targeting this rather large decrease, 150 basis points. Excuse me. Another factoid, I apologize, for kind of throwing all this information at you. The main interest rate that the Fed targets is called this federal funds rate, which is really unfortunately named because it makes it sound like the Fed has direct control, where it would say like, oh, it was 2, I want it at 0.5. Let me just use a keystroke to put that in there. That's not how it works. All right. What a federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks borrow money from each other. All right. Remember, when you deposit money at a bank, they don't keep it all in the vault. How a bank makes money is that it loans it out to other people. So let's say a bank might have like $10 million in deposits from all of its customers. In the vault, it might have 500K. And then what happens if an unexpected number of people want to get all their money back? The answer is the bank could borrow money from one of its competitors, and it does so at this federal funds rate. If you're the kind of person that follows financial news, about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a scandal for a particular interest rate called the LIBOR, LIBOR. And I want to say that's London Intrabank something something. All right. But that was effectively the UK's version of the federal funds rate. So the idea is that if the Fed can pursue actions to lower the federal funds rate, that will encourage banks to lower their interest rates. And obviously more people will be borrowing, and that will stimulate the economy. The way you do that is that you make money, or the cash or the currency itself, more plentiful. The more cash that it is out there, the easier it is to get a loan, and the lower that the interest rate is going to be. Now, if you look at the money stock in the United States over the past 20, 50, or 100 years, what we are witnessing is truly unprecedented. All right. Since the pandemic began, so this is only going back like 5 quarters or so, we've increased the money stock by 25%. If you go back to prior to the Great Recession, there's basically twice as much money out there as there was 10, 15 years ago. If you're thinking to yourself, shouldn't this lead to more inflation? Hold on to that thought. I got a whole set of slides for that. But nevertheless, this is how the Fed has pursued these actions, basically by printing more money, putting it out there, which makes it more plentiful, which ultimately lowers interest rates and therefore stimulates the economy. So what we're looking at here between these two responses, oh, I spelled responses wrong. How embarrassing. Look at that. What can I tell you? All right, I make mistakes too. But nevertheless, what we are looking at, despite that spelling error, is that both our budgetary or fiscal and our monetary or the printing of money response is doing the same thing, both stimulating the economy. All right. If you study this stuff in other countries, believe me, there are some countries where they are doing different things fiscally and monetarily. And of course, to an economist, like it's just abject confusion. All right. It's almost like they got to get on the same page kind of thing. And here's the reference to housing here, right? When you print that much money, you do lower interest rates. When you lower interest rates, you make the cost of borrowing lower, and therefore you increase the demand for housing. So one of the things that we might be seeing right now is just perpetually low interest rates that are obviously now stimulating growth in the housing market. Good. I think I'm okay on time here. So I thought I'd share with you some professional forecasting. All right. Not kind of stuff that I would just kind of tease out there, but over the last week or so, I looked at 4 organizations. The 2 on this page are really looking more at the global economy, and the 2 on the next page are focused on the United States. Probably heard of these organizations, the IMF and the World Bank. All right, about depending on the organization, either every quarter or every year, they'll release some sort of economic forecast. So the IMF releases what they call the World Economic Outlook. I want to say this was done just before New Year's, like late December, early January of 2021. And you can see what they're projecting here. This is in world GDP now. All right, so this is not specific to the United States, but 6% is a big number. All right, no question about it, with it kind of tailing off a little bit in 2022. Also, big warnings in this report about just how much uncertainty that there is. During the pandemic, I was fielding occasional calls from reporters about what's going on with the economy. And they would say, like, so when do you think we're going to get out of this? And what I would usually say is like, ask a virologist, ask a scientist, ask a medical doctor, because like this isn't really going to get quote unquote normal until we have found a way to defeat the pandemic. So a lot of these economic forecasts have like a big capital if the COVID-19 pandemic will continue to subside. Here's the World Bank one, pretty similar. All right, slightly smaller. All right, I guess this you would consider the World Bank one to be a little bit more pessimistic, but 4% growth in world GDP, that's still a pretty darn big number. All right, they use the word subdued a couple of times, which I think is pretty funny. And what's interesting about the World Bank report is that it came out sooner than the IMF one. So this one down here at the bottom was like late March. And so at that time, the pandemic in India and Brazil particularly was raging, all right, during that period. And so there's a lot of like cautionary tales like, look, we said it was 6% like about 3 months ago, but now we're seeing what's going on in these large economies. And because they have been unable to completely contain the pandemic, that could probably hurt their economic growth. I thought this was interesting too. Decade of disappointment. I don't know why they're so depressed over there in the World Bank, but this is a pretty important point. Like usually, if you look back historically at the United States or other countries, periods after recessions have low growth. In other words, like what's really rare about what's going on is that how we completely flip that script one quarter after the pandemic began. Usually you're in a recession, and think the Great Recession, right? Like we're in the middle of it. And then over a long period of time, we see that slow and steady march of a decrease of unemployment and an increase in GDP. All right. So coming out of a recession is usually not a big party, right? It's like a slow healing process. And so that's what the World Bank is trying to put out there, that look, this is a unique event, but nevertheless, like when we look back at similar things, we might be in for smaller growth than we anticipate. Here's the story for two prominent American forecasts, one coming out of the Fed and the other one coming out of one of the big four. I think there's four accounting firms. Sorry, I have a hard time keeping up with that stuff, but everybody's heard of Deloitte nevertheless. All right. Federal Reserve has an interesting summary of projections. What they do is that they survey their own economists, in other words, the people that are leading the Fed, and they ask them questions about growth in the United States based on a variety of assumptions. And you can see, look, the Federal Reserve, 6.5 in the United States, that's huge. And hey, I tell you what, while I'm here, like, let me just give you this fact for a second. Every now and then, particularly during presidential elections, like people will compare American growth to another country, and usually that other country is China. Keep in mind, especially if you're an econ major, all right, you should not expect the American economy to grow at the same rate as an economy that is less developed, all right? Usually the path is like, if I can draw a quick graph, it's like something like this. All right, so for countries that are down here, it's just a lot easier for them to grow faster. If the United States is right here, it's a lot harder for us to match like some of those growth rates. So I guess I'm thinking about this because 6.5 is an enormous number by American standards. All right, I'd say American standards, a good growth rate is something between 2 and 3%. And that's what they're projecting going forward. So they're optimistic. All right. But I guess like now that I'm seeing that 6.5, I wanted to put that out there because it kind of frustrates me when I hear people compare our growth to a smaller place. And again, like, hey, if you were an econ major, my friends, this is just law of diminishing returns. All right. Working its way through the macro economy. Excuse me. Deloitte's United States economic forecast, they are a little bit more squirrelish over there in that they don't offer one projection. They have like what they call the most likely, then an optimistic, and then a pessimistic. I think they estimated their baseline to be a 55% probability. I have no idea how they came up with that number. It seems impossible, right, to put odds on like 3 different scenarios. But hey, you know, like I'm sure they got smart people there, so I don't want to turn it down. And what's most important here is that when you compare the Fed's prediction to Deloitte's, Deloitte is a lot more bearish. All right, still positive growth in 2021, but also a lot smaller. And this fact right here, all right, here's something that was immediately apparent in the data once the pandemic began. Our savings rate in the United States exploded. And that sounds like a good thing. It sounds like something you would tell your kid, right, to save money. But on a macro scale, when people are not spending money, that translates into less product and less growth overall. So if you wanted to make like an immediate connection, like how did we fall off? Like, well, obviously, like we couldn't buy everything that we did before. We're not going to restaurants, we're not traveling, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of that was just fed right into the savings rate. And so what's interesting about the United States is that this country and its citizens is sitting on a ton of cash, all right? $5 trillion saved in the first 3 quarters of 2020. Remember, in a typical year, our GDP is $21-22 trillion. So we were basically saving about a quarter of our entire GDP. Again, completely unprecedented numbers. And now imagine this, if that savings gets unleashed, guess what? All that means is an increase in growth, all right? And that might be what's happening this summer, all right? As we all look to get back to our normal lives, take vacations, et cetera, et cetera. Where's that money gonna come from? Right out of the savings that we didn't spend because we were all trapped in our houses about 1 year ago today. All right, Appreciate your attention. We're in the home stretch here. Current questions about where we're going forward. I think these are two minor questions, but they are still important. That's why I put them on a slide. We do have many countries successfully fighting the virus. The United States, I'm very happy to say, is one of them. Massachusetts, just in particular, very fortunate to be here, like has really the track of the data has really been strong. So that's going great. Sadly, this has not been the case in other countries. Recent examples are India, although it has been getting better over the past month or so, and Brazil, which is having a hard time containing the virus. And I don't need to tell you guys, if the virus is not contained, that's going to impact the economy. Of course, that's what we just all lived through. Here's another kind of open question. What's up with this savings? All right. If we are spending the savings, which seems pretty likely, that is great news for GDP. All right. Because obviously we are buying things, which becomes income for somebody else, which means they're going to buy more stuff, which becomes income for somebody else. And the econ majors out there might know this as the old multiplier effect. All right. That's what we're expecting. The downside of that is one reason that we have such low interest rates is that there's so much savings in the bank. There's so much money out there to be borrowed. If we decide to spend that savings, then that's going to put upward pressure on the interest rates. All right. As you probably know, there's no such thing as just abject good news when it comes to economics. The classic quote I want to say is from Truman, where he said something like, give me a one-armed economist. I'm sick of these guys, because every time one of them walks in here, they always say things like, well, on the one hand, this, but on the other hand, that. And this is a classic example of this right here. Definitely want that savings to be spent, because we're going to feel those short-term gains. Probably would raise interest rates down the road if we do so, because once again, where we borrow money is from other people's savings. Simple as that. Of course, the opposite side could be true. If we decide we're just going to sit on that savings, bad news for GDP, good news for the interest rate. All right, just how it is. And then this right here. All right, if you want to sound smart at a future dinner party, I don't know why you would talk about economics, but nevertheless, like if you wanted to do this anyway, all right, the question I think that has us buzzing the most on the macro, especially the data people like I am, would be, where is the inflation? All right. And we haven't been asking this since the pandemic began. We've been asking this since 2010 and coming out of the Great Recession, because we have a lot of things that economic theory would ultimately predict should be raising prices. However, prices really haven't moved all that much over the past 10, 12 years, despite all of these minor bullet points, which economic theory would say should put upward pressure on prices and therefore create inflation. All right. Number one, the money supply. If you print a ton of money, you do make it less special. And when that happens, prices go up because of it. All right. Number two, extensive government borrowing. All right. Again, I apologize for shouting out all the econ majors, but there's so many terms here that I know you guys have heard before that I'm guessing you've forgotten because you just haven't been in the classroom recently enough. Crowding out of investment is usually a reference that when the government borrows a lot of money, guess what? They borrow it from the same places that we do. All right. That increases demand for borrowing, which usually raises interest rates. And that obviously could slow things down. Long-term impacts of expansionary and monetary policy. All right, those are actually, and I'm looking at this bullet point, that's kind of exactly what I'm explaining in the previous two, so I'll just skip that. And then here's another shout out to the old econ majors. All right, usually prices are what economists call are sticky. All right, and what we mean by that is that they don't immediately update to changing conditions. Some classic examples that I give from principals all the way up to my seniors in econometrics would be in Hurricane Katrina. All right, so we're now, I believe we're back in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. And then Hurricane Rita that followed it. So now we're obviously in the Gulf of Mexico, Houston, and New Orleans. Obviously devastation. All right, terrible, terrible event. Guess what happened to the prices of milk in New Orleans and Houston? Basically didn't move. All right, price of bread, grocery store stuff, gasoline stuff, different story, because obviously they're pulling gas out of the Gulf of Mexico there. But nevertheless, this is just an illustration that we are slow to change prices to economic conditions. And then eventually, like, there's just so much pent up pressure on prices that obviously that gets unleashed. There are some examples of products out there that we use all the time that are extremely responsive to changing conditions. And a classic example of that is gas prices, which I'm sure you guys know every summer, regardless of what's going on in the rest of the world, gas prices go up. And that's just a reflection that people are driving more in the summer, vacations, visiting family, et cetera, et cetera. Housing prices are usually slow, but those have been going up. Investment incomes have also been going up. And I'm measuring investment incomes here by the money that we're deriving from what we get out of the stock market, as an example, like our retirement accounts or something, which if you've had in the stock market over the last year, it's been a roller coaster, all right, to see what happened when it initially dropped and then to see where it is today. Like I'm looking at my retirement account, kind of like the rest of these data, and I'm saying to myself, I haven't seen changes like this ever. This is wild. And so the next question is like, would overall prices be next? Again, this feels like the answer is yes, but like if I was giving this talk 5 years ago, not even talking about the pandemic, I would have given this exact slide probably. All right. We've been talking like this of where is the inflation based on everything that we're doing. And so this is the kind of thing that is the current puzzle and mystery in macroeconomics is that you have all of these inflationary forces that theory and previous experience tells us should raise prices. And then you look at the price level and it's not really going up by all that much. And so we'll conclude that exactly how we began by just looking at data. I mean, this is my life, people. Like if you've had me in class, like, you know, this is where I'm most comfortable. And so like, it just seemed natural to me to obviously just give you a picture of prices here. We're going back to 2007 here because what I wanted to show you, we'll go green now, is what happened to prices during the Great Recession. They dropped almost immediately. All right, so here's one example where prices were really responsive, to the recession. Then we have this relatively flat path like so. And I have this orange circle here because I'm looking mostly at this trend right there. And look, that's not enough data to say that prices are definitely going up and inflation is coming, but it's the beginning of it. All right. Like usually when you look back at a long period of time and you see growth like that, I mean, typically what happens is that, of course, like this will continue to trend up. But, you know, we see periods where it just goes up pretty quickly and then it just falls right down. All right. So this is kind of the classic mystery right now is that we have all these inflationary pressures. We see some examples of prices going up, but we don't see that in the overall measures of inflation. Are we going to see that in the future? I don't know. And obviously that's what we're looking for. So I'll close by saying this. I think you have every reason to be optimistic about the macro economy. All right. If you're sitting on a house right now, congratulations. This is great. If you've got a retirement account, wonderful. All right. Even better. If you're out there on the other end of the spectrum and looking for a job, hey, you're in good shape too. All right. Because the unemployment rate is going down. So a lot of optimism going forward. I would say this is the one factor that we're looking at because if prices go up, interest rates go up with it. When interest rates go up, obviously that pushes back investment and can contract the economy. So this is what the Fed and everybody else is trying to keep their eye on to see what overall prices are doing as we go through what is clearly a pretty large expansion. All right, I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm back. All right. What happens now, Matt? What do we do? Take questions? What's going on?
Yeah, so we can. So thanks for talking us through the slides. We we have some time, 10-15 minutes at least to do some Q&A. So like I said at the beginning, don't be shy. Feel free to submit through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. We do have a couple submitted before the meeting today, or I guess the presentation today. So I'll start with those while things trickle in the Q&A function. So, first, so we talked a little bit about the housing market recently, but like kind of post-COVID, if we look forward, a couple of years, how do you kind of think the housing market is going to change if we step away from what's going on right now?
I think it's going to grow. I think the only thing that's going to slow it down is when interest rates go up. So that's what I would watch out for. If you are in the housing market right now, in other words, you're looking to move, looking to buy for the first time, Hey, no promises. You know what I mean? This is a hard thing to predict, but I think housing prices are going to continue to go up. Again, there was all that savings too. So you have a whole bunch of people that have down payments, you know what I mean, that probably didn't have them before. Couple that with low interest rates. I think we're just seeing the beginning of housing prices rising, in my opinion. And the real threat there, again, is inflation and interest rates. So here's another connection to make. Inflation and interest rates usually are in the same ballpark, right? When inflation is high, interest rates are high, and likewise low. And so keep your eye on both of those things, because any upward pressure on interest rates is going to increase the cost of borrowing, which is going to push back on the housing market. But as of yet, I don't see any sign of that.
Yeah, and so there was another question that's a little bit tied to that outlook on U.S. interest rates. It sounds like we could probably expect some increases in interest rates. I know I've seen the Fed talking about it a little bit over the past couple of months and flagging inflation as a concern, at least a little bit publicly. So it sounds like that would be a similar type of expectation from your perspective.
Yeah, for a long time, the Fed had a hard time. If the Fed, by the way, sets a target of 2% inflation, and if you're wondering why do they do that, well, the reason why you wanted it to is that if you find yourself in a position where you need to stimulate the economy, you have to lower interest rates. So like a zero interest rate or something pretty close to it, it's kind of a problem for the Fed, because if something bad happens, we lose our tool to be able to lower interest rates because they're already at zero. There are examples of negative interest rates, but they're rare. All right. Very unlikely to happen. So, prior to the pandemic, the Fed was trying to, that's why they pump so much money in the economy. They're trying to get to 2, right? So they have room on the gas pedal, you know what I mean, if they need to go down. So it's been kind of like the existential threat at the Fed. And it sounds weird. Like, why would you even target inflation? Like, why not keep it the same? Like, people don't like when prices go up. And there's no question about it, but like that ability of the Fed to respond quickly is really one of our greatest assets. Fiscal policy is slow, right? It's got to go through the Congress and the president. And we did this really quickly. So I'm proud of both administrations. You know what I mean? They got this done quick, so no judgment on that. But the Fed is like our emergency copter, you know what I mean? And what we need to be able to do is to keep inflation at a level where we could use the copter to respond as quickly as we can.
Yeah. No, that it was pretty interesting to see how quick the response was when the pandemic first. But I mean, I guess it was initially maybe slow, maybe we were a little slow to react. But once it really hit in the United States, it was very rapid pace with the government. So
yeah, how about this for like a positive message? Like it seems like politically, right? Like everything is just nobody can talk to each other, et cetera, et cetera. They did this incredibly quickly. And like, you want an example, like look at what the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act when Obama was in office and how long it took to make that sausage. I mean, we flew right compared to how we did it. So yeah, it's not all broken. You know what I mean? It feels like that way sometimes, but it really isn't.
Yeah. No, thanks. And so here's the next question. This is maybe a little bit outside your specialty particularly, but it's in reference to some of the aid packages that were passed last March, but with none of the aid being passed for theaters, being dispersed to theaters, what is your thought on what would happen to the performing arts sector? I do know that I was in DC at the time. The Kennedy Center did get $25 million to do renovations as part of the CARES Act, which was, I'm not sure how they snuck that in there, but they did.
Well, I don't know if you can see, I got a lot of, I'm a music fan myself. I got a lot of equipment behind me. Here's a hard truth. Okay. Other than, of course, TV, big concerts and things like that, a lot of the arts are publicly funded. All right. And look, if you got a problem with that, I get it. If you feel like, look, if the government didn't fund this, like they disappear and you're on the other side, like I get that too, And so, this isn't great for the arts because no budgetary contraction is quite frankly, good for the arts at all. So they might find themselves in a difficult spot. We'll still have it. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to paint a picture like, the country has abandoned art. That's not the case. But look, they're feeling the pinch. There's no question about it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. So we have had a couple questions come in from people in the crowd here. So the first one's, now that the Jacksonville Jaguars have both Urban Meyer and Tim Tebow, how much do you expect the Jacksonville economy to grow the next year? about 1,000%.
I know that kid that sent that question, and I'll deal with him later. But Kevin, man, I should have wrote you when Urban took that job. So for the rest of you, like, this is a friendly dispute between an Ohio State and a University of Florida person that initially started around Urban Meyer and now has blossomed into what is really a beautiful friendship. So Kevin, that's hilarious. I miss seeing you around, but we all know the answer to that. Hey, how about this real quick, like a serious thing? Listen, people, sports do not lead to economic growth, period, end of sentence, donezo. All right. And if you want a reason why, here's the situation. If you took all the professional sports in the United States, it's about the size of the cardboard box industry. All right. Would you ever put a cardboard box factory in downtown and say, like, well, just wait for the money to roll in? All right. Of course you wouldn't. Sports are fascinating to study because they kind of mess with our decision-making process of how we think of dollars and cents. So no, Jacksonville will not be wealthier. They'll be happier though. And isn't that really what matters? All right. And I'm a Jags fan now because Urban is there. So, like, how about that? They getting this fan, but I'm not going to buy any of the gear. I don't really like that, like, teal thing they got going on. So what are you going to do?
Road trip for the fall.
There you go.
Okay, so our next question that came in, can you discuss the implications if the administration continues with foreign tariffs that the previous administration had imposed, leading up to COVID?
Yeah. Okay. A lot of thoughts on this. In most situations, nearly all of them, tariffs are a bad idea. All right. Because they just raise prices. It's as simple as that. Like, a tariff could come from a good place. You know what I mean? We're going to tax, let's say, Chinese steel because we're trying to protect jobs in Pittsburgh. All right. Nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, no offense to Matt. I actually like Pittsburgh. Unlike Matt, who doesn't like Ohio. The Ohioans. We look at Midwesterners as, brothers and sisters, basically. But in all honesty, like, the problem with import tariffs is that, sure, like, we've helped these people out in Youngstown and Pittsburgh and Allegheny and et cetera, but who have we hurt? Everybody that buys steel. All right. And so it's one of those situations where you have diffuse losses, those increase in prices to all of us, and concentrated gains. And when you do the math out, what usually happens is that the losses are far larger than the gains. Man, and let me tell you, it's tough to look at somebody that's like a 56-year-old person in a steel industry and just say, you know what? Like, this isn't where we should be putting our eggs. And so I can appreciate politicians, like, this has got to be hard, you know what I mean, to manage your constituency and deal with this economic reality. Another thing about tariffs, the United States is not a huge trader. All right. And I'm saying that on a world stage, like, our GDP is about 13% imported. All right. And by the way, we sell about 12% of stuff. Things about, like, so here's another frustration, things about the trade deficit. Listen, the trade deficit is nonsense. All right. It could be $8 trillion. We don't care. All right. I have a trade deficit with the grocery store. All right. Where I give them money. And, like, of course, like, what I get in return are groceries. All right. The reason why we have a trade deficit is because we're buying things that are made cheaper elsewhere than are here. And so, to wrap this back around, like, I don't think the tariffs are that big economically, except to the areas, like, if we're talking about Chinese steel and we're hyper focused in on Pittsburgh. I don't think any tariff is going to move American GDP. All right, because we simply just don't trade enough for that to be a reality. Hey, we're a Central European country. We might be trading 50 or 60% because we're about the size of a New England state. You know what I mean? And we're not producing everything. We got the same currency as a bunch of these neighbors. And so that's why they're up there. We're kind of geographically isolated. All right. Our three biggest trading partners are obviously Mexico, Canada, and then the third one is China. All right. With, of course, obviously different side of the world, but a statement about what they produce. So I think the tariffs are interesting politically, but again, unless you're in a specific micro area, right, for the good that they're talking about, I don't think it's anything to get worked up in terms of American GDP or unemployment or inflation, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry to say.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I saw that play through a little bit with a business I was familiar with that imported disposable gloves for the food service industry, because the United States has basically outlawed the manufacturing in the United States due to the chemicals that are released. And so they're, almost all of the supply in the U.S. is imported from China for that reason. And there were massive price increases, and again, it was very localized to that product in particular, just because you can't get it from anywhere else. So
I think that's the right story. You absolutely, whoever wrote that, you absolutely could be impacted by these tariffs, depending on the area that you live and the industry that you're in. So I don't want to minimize the concern there. One of my favorite stories about this has to do with Pittsburgh, and I think we're back in 2004. This is George W. Bush campaigning at a stop somewhere in the Pittsburgh area. Great photo op, right? He's talking to steel workers, so they're wearing whatever steel workers wear. You know what I'm saying? All politicians do it. This is not a statement about W or anything like that. But he says, at the end, we're going to tax incoming Chinese steel. Didn't say it exactly like that, but that was the point. The government in China hears about this and then announces that if the United States does this, what China is going to tax is oranges from Florida. And they specifically picked oranges from Florida because they knew it was a swing state. All right. And so that's another negative benefit of import tariffs, is that when one country slaps an import tariff on one, usually they're retaliated. And so it's this ramping up. And so things like NAFTA, or the recent reforming of NAFTA, which happened during the Trump administration, which was kind of in my opinion, what they did there is a 2.0 NAFTA. It did need it updated because the stuff we're buying and selling just ain't the same as it was in 1994. These are very positive developments because they stop that one-upsmanship process that sometimes can happen between two countries and import tariffs.
No, it was definitely interesting to watch that play out. So I've got a question here. This has to do with the labor market. How do economists generally view the dynamics in the labor market with so many businesses unable to find workers right now, as a result of what many people point to extended fiscal measures that have been implemented in the economy?
That's a good one. I don't have a great answer for that. I can tell you what some of the theories are. Usually the businesses that they're talking about are the businesses that were forced to lay off or furlough or fire people right during the pandemic. So I'm thinking service industry. That's what we hear a lot about here in Worcester. Restaurants are opening back up. They're trying to get the wait staff back, the dishwashers, the cooks, and it's not as easy, right, as it used to be. Some people would say part of this is the benefits. We extended unemployment benefits, and so we might have dampened the incentive to go back to work. That could be true. This is an individual thing, for each person to decide. But those benefits will expire. All right. And so I guess my opinion is, just looking at the unemployment rate, I'm optimistic that over time this will play out and they're going to find the people that they need. All right. Because they found them before. You know what I'm saying? And so I don't think things have changed so differently. We clearly want to go back to restaurants. That's the kind of behavior that I see, that people are more than happy to go to a stadium, you know what I mean? A restaurant, try to take vacations and the like. And so I think obviously they might have to raise their wages to do that, but every business has to do that at some point. So it's a problem, but I think it's going to solve itself, is my opinion.
Do you see any risk if people are taking advantage of the opportunity to potentially not work at this time? What a lot of people have seen in the business world is kind of a massive adoption of technology that would have been premature 24 months ago, but businesses are finding ways to adapt using technology. Do you think there's risk of people not working in those industries specifically being replaced by technology and maybe permanently dislocated out of work?
Boy, this kind of, to me, this kind of answer sounds a lot like that tariff answer, in the sense that if your view is the entire country, all right, we've had periods of automation before, all right, and our unemployment rate leading up to the pandemic was the lowest we've ever recorded. All right. At the time, what we thought, of course, was the most advanced economy that the United States has ever produced. And we lost the VCR, and whoever worked in that industry, right? We lost the phonograph, name your dead technology, right? We lost all that stuff, right? But yet we are still employing people. So from a macro view, sorry about that. From a macro view, I think we're perfectly fine. All right. However, Like, again, kind of like that steel worker who's like 50 and 60, who, you know, is becoming obsolete. You could tell the same thing about like an automobile worker, you know what I mean? Where the automation has gone there. That's probably the mailman. I'll stop in a second. Sorry. I don't know what to say to those people. You know, I sometimes I give this anecdote in class, like, you know, if you were from Michigan and let's say you graduated high school in like 1980. All right. So you'd be about pushing 60 at this point. Back in 1980, like working at the GM plant was probably a super intelligent economic decision. They had a pension, right? They had work benefits. You knew people that lived, that worked there, all right, that had good things to say about it. And then like fast forward to the 90s and the aughts, et cetera, et cetera. And now you're 40 and 50, you've got children, right? I mean, you've got roots down in the area and your industry is becoming obsolete. All right. You want somebody like me to come and say like, well, there's jobs in Georgia. You know what I mean? Like, just go there. I can't do it. You know what I mean? Just retrain yourself. You know what I mean? And the person would say, but I'm 50, you know, 60, like, you know, I'm on my way out. Like, I'm not on my way in. And so like, I don't have a great message for those people other than like, we've seen this over and over. So I am optimistic that the robots are not going to take all of our jobs. I am still optimistic that'll be the case, but it is going to take some jobs. And just like through the course of human history, we're just going to have to adapt to the ones that cannot be replaced going forward. My dad is a retired mortgage officer. And one of the things that kind of pushed him out was just how easy it is to get a mortgage now through on your computer through Quicken Loans. That was all like an in-person process. And that's really where he thrived. You know, he's a people person. You do well by one client, they recommend you to somebody else, you know, and he navigates you through the process, et cetera, et cetera. Well, like if he were 20 years old today, I think he'd be in a different industry. You know what I mean? I think he'd be working because, you know, I love my dad. I think he's a super smart guy. But, you know, the situation from his work is clearly changing. And I kind of wonder about like the younger people, like in his office, like maybe they will still have jobs. I don't know that for sure, but it just seems like that's automating pretty quickly. I know that's happening to a lot of people out there too.
Yeah. Okay, maybe one or two more here. So you talked about money supply and fiscal interventions over the past 10 years since the, 10 plus years since the Great Recession. What is the consensus among economists that growth in the money supply is going to be slowed, reduced, permanently, if at all, continue to grow? And how does the Fed combat fiscal pressures? We saw it a little bit pre-pandemic in 2019 to keep rates low, coming from the federal government.
That's the existential threat of the Fed. So let's imagine that the recovery is slow because there's inflation, right? There's just for that reason itself, and that slows everything down. The Fed would normally try to put its foot on the gas and pump more money into the economy. Well, that's what it's been doing for the last 15 years. And so what the Fed would ultimately like to do is kind of get like inflation reset to a place where it has the ability to kind of pull back. All right. If the economy overheats, the Fed is fine, because what the Fed can do is contractionary. It can raise its rates. Lord knows it has plenty of room to do that. All right. So the Fed is not worried so much about a continued expansion, because the expansion should raise rates, inflation, you know what I mean, eventually, and get us back to where it wants to be. The Fed's worried about the opposite. All right. Which is that if we contract again, like we lose that medical helicopter ability to lower interest rates because they're already pretty darn close to zero. All right. So, we got our smartest people working on it. That I can assure you. But as you can imagine, like we've got economic forces, that are really hard to manage. The Fed's got a difficult job, like in their marching orders. The Fed is totally independent. The presidents can argue with what the Fed does. They appoint those people and approved by Congress. But think of it like the Supreme Court. It's not a lifetime position, but like once you're on the court, in this case, the board, you don't take marching orders from anybody. All right. You do whatever you want. And like President Trump got mad at the Fed like a couple of years ago. And I told the students at the time, like, that's not unusual. All right. He's doing some unusual stuff, but like presidents arguing with the head of the Fed, that's not news.
Yeah.
President wants to do things right away. Fed's got a 14-year appointment, the people on that board. And so, that's how it's supposed to work, short-term versus long-term interest, so
Yeah.
that was one example. I was like, yeah, great. You know what I mean? This is exactly how the sausage should get made. You know what I mean? Where they're trying to like balance both of those things. But the Fed's in a tough spot. If we contract, if we expand, I think the Fed will breathe a sigh of relief
Yeah.
and they'll be like, we're ready for the next one now. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Because we've got the room to lower rates when we need to.
Yeah. Okay. Well, no, that was it in terms of questions that I've received here. So if anyone else, wants to lob one in here quickly, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we will thank Professor Baumann for his time and investment in the alumni community. I know I enjoyed just reconnecting with him over the past 4 or 6 months since we started talking about this as a potential event related to the 2011 reunion, 10-year reunion. So definitely have thoroughly enjoyed to listening to you to speak again. I had the fortune of having you in class back in, I think it was 2010, and you're in the antitrust class. So it's great to have another lecture from you.
I really appreciate that. And I really am honest about this. I'm just one of those people that right place, right time. This has been a great job for me. And like events like this, I'm always happy to do because one of the bad things about the job is that when kids graduate, like they don't always stay in touch and you just kind of wonder, it's like, boy, I wonder whatever happened to Matt. Well, I know what happened to Kevin. But anyway, it's great to see this. And again, like for those of you that I don't know, like I'm almost more impressed with you that here we are like on a Saturday morning, you're trying to learn a little bit. So by all means, if you have any other questions, my email is right up on there. You just have to find me through the department. And I hope to see you guys on campus again. This really is a special institution. I'm very fortunate to be working there. And I just can't help but think about that stuff, when I do events like this. So thanks for the opportunity. This has been wonderful for me too.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Professor Baumann. We appreciate your time.
All right, Holy Cross. I hope to see you guys again soon.
All righty.